And it was reflected in the coping mechanisms, as in men feel that they want to be agents in their lives, and therefore they will take really unhealthy levels of self-blame and responsibility. Well, I didn't act in a certain way, I didn't protect myself, and so on and so forth. Therefore, I'm the one to be blamed. And almost a way to take the power from the perpetrator or the abuser and the rapist to draw it back to themselves.
Hi, I'm Naomi Murphy, and this is the Locked Up Living podcast, where we talk with a wide range of people about harsh aspects of institutional life.
We also explore some of the ways to overcome them and to grow and develop. I'm David Jones. So join us every Wednesday morning, 6 o'clock UK time, for a fresh podcast.
So today we're speaking with Dr. Kennath WidanaralalageI. Ken is a lecturer in psychology at the University of Westminster. He's a qualitative researcher interested in understanding how victim survivors make sense of their victimisation, coping strategies and experiences accessing support and involving the criminal justice system. During his PhD, he explored men's experiences of rape and sexual abuse in adolescence and adulthood. Working with men made him increasingly interested in committing and understanding and supporting marginalised, seldom-heard groups using qualitative methods to provide a platform where individuals can tell their stories and break their silence. He believes in the value of personal experiences and the transfer of knowledge to help others and to hopefully create a better society for survivors and their close networks. And I heard Ken speak recently at the Psychology of Men conference, and I think what really came across was your passion and commitment to doing justice by your participants, I think, Ken, which really came through in your presentation. So really delighted to have you on the podcast today. Welcome.
Thank you. Thank you so much.
Hi Ken, very good to meet you, and thanks very much for being with us today. Can you perhaps begin by describing your career pathway, and how did you come to be researching male experiences of sexual violence?
I think in many ways it's not particularly extraordinary career path, also because it's quite brief and I'm really at the beginning of it. Quite straightforward, studying psychology with a focus on criminology. And I originally come from, my parents are Sri Lanka, but I lived all my life in Italy. So this idea of gender stereotypes has always been interesting, or at least interesting in the back of my mind. And I was fortunate enough to encounter the right type of mentors who directed me towards research focusing primarily on female-focused rape myths. So all of the stereotypes that we as a society tend to hold around what victims should look like, or how a type of sexually violent incident would occur. I think I got hooked on by this type of research and this type of inquiry, trying to understand how people blame others. But it became increasingly obvious that there was a really big gap around men. We always thought about the male perpetrator, we justify men being sexually aggressive. And there was almost a question, I am not sexually aggressive, or I'm not an aggressive person. And the majority of the men in my life are normal men. And so almost by chance, I typed in male victims, and it almost like a world opened up. The world of men. I think in the conference, someone said around 50% of the population is made up of men. So it's quite likely that victims would be there. And that was the case. And there was this particular paper by Coxell and King from 2010, in which they described something around how we always focus on the fight and flight response from a very evolutionary or even biological perspective, and very rarely focus on how we freeze. And we're reporting a series of experiences from men around how they felt immobilized when they were subjected to sexually violent incidents. And that was really almost shocked me, because I never thought about the possibility of a man. And I was relatively young at the time. I was in my really late, maybe 19, 20. And it really, really challenged me. And that was the starting point at which I became increasingly interested. I, again, found the right mentor who wanted me to pursue a PhD. And got here.
Thank you very much. That's very interesting. You're reminding me that many years ago, a colleague of mine who's a psychoanalyst was working on issues of male eating disorders. And just as you're describing, there was very little written about male eating disorders. In fact, it was really thought that it didn't exist. So there are some interesting parallels there. And I suppose what you're suggesting really, and this is to do my next question as well, is there a need for sexual violence to be viewed through a gendered prism?
It's a very difficult question, and because there is an element to it where it can be even controversial to say that experiences are gendered. On one hand, I think that the narrative is built around the fact that speaking about sexual violence as gendered is used to almost view that it only happens to women because men have certain gendered characteristics that lead them to act in a certain way. And to some extent, we can believe that, and we can accept it because a lot of women have the majority of victims of sexual violence are women, and we can't deny that the element. However, it denies the nuances of the experiences, and overly focusing on gender can be complicated if we think about it only in terms of prevalence and incidence of the event. So at the same time, at the other side of the coin, especially in my research, but I think this comes across also for female victims, victims' experiences will be gendered because gender defines quite a lot of the ways that we see ourselves, not only in the way that we identify, but also how we position ourselves in terms of our society. As a man, I do feel the expectations around feeling accountable or strong, try to control my emotions, even though I consider myself someone who is in touch with these emotions. And this really comes across in victims' experiences, and that's why gender, it's a difficult balance that needs to be played around, not using gender as a way to either minimize one group or the other, but use it to acknowledge the individual experience perhaps.
Thank you, yes. Now, I'm not quite sure whether I heard this earlier on, but when do you think accounts of sexual violence against men and boys started appearing in the research literature?
I think that this is a very interesting question, because if you don't go out of your way to look for it, at least up until 2 to 3 years ago, you wouldn't find anything. The field of interpersonal violence was, maybe this word is loaded, so I just use it in the actual meaning of it. It was saturated with research focusing on women's experiences. Not to say that it's wrong, and there is very good reasons for it, but it was very, very hard to come by research that focused on men's experiences. It only came across if you typed in or looked specifically at key terms that looked at male victims and male as survivors. Things I think are changing. I think I am starting to see more even work that focuses on female victims, acknowledging that there are also male victims to be considered, but it's always, and it's still very much like a side note. Very interestingly, in the research that focuses on men, I think at least myself, I must have wrote at least a paragraph acknowledging the fact that the majority of victims are women, and to try and almost justify that this research is not designed to minimize or overlook or say, oh, we solved the female problem, because we obviously have not. But I don't see the thing for the female side of the research.
Mm. It's interesting you should feel you need to do that.
Yeah, I think maybe it's personal, but I do feel the need to do it because I don't want to come across, or I don't want this type of research to come across as oppositional, or because it isn't. It shouldn't be. Focusing on one group doesn't mean that you don't care about it. Putting it very simplistically, it doesn't mean that you don't care about the other one. But the perception sometimes is, or people do have this perception, unless you engage in a detailed and in-depth conversation, which is unfortunate. But again, we are really at the beginning. I do feel that despite the fact that there are decades of research in it, I think in the UK, if we want to focus specifically on this country or these countries, the voices of men are coming forward a little more prominently, I hope.
Good. And I really like the way that you juxtaposed saturated with loaded, illustrating really how important it is to be careful about the terms that we use. So, thinking about your research, how did you recruit participants? Was this a challenging task?
Very. It was very hard, and it's probably not surprising that it was hard to recruit men to take part on research. And you have to be honest, you have to be transparent. You have to tell them that when you advertise the research, we are going to be talking about your experience of sexual violence. It's going to be potentially triggering. It's part of the process. There needs to be the element of transparency. And I think also the fact that I started collecting data right in the middle of the national restrictions for COVID did not help because, and this is not necessarily because it was hard to physically reach participants, but I made sure that the protocols, services were involved in the protocols because I wanted to make sure that there was a safety network for those who took part that they could fall back onto. If, for example, they found the interview particularly challenging, they had a service in place, a support system, a professional support system in place to support them. And I really do feel, and something that's probably underexplored and probably a very interesting area and useful area of research would be to see the strain that the COVID-19 pandemic has had on services that work with victims of interpersonal violence. Because my experience, and I had this really maybe privilege is not the right word, but position where I could see how services struggled to engage with a relatively small PhD student. So I can imagine that with bigger work, that could have been even more challenging. And so there were several challenges in place. The circumstances were probably not the best, and the topic is in itself very loaded and very difficult to talk about. I think it was reflected in the type of men that came forward to take part in our research. It's almost like the topic and the focus of the research almost create a recruitment bias, let's put it this way, or helped a specific group of male survivors to come forward. And the men who came forward were predominantly white. They were and had historic experiences of sexual violence. So that, by that, I mean that it happened between 25 to 30 years. The interview took place 25 to 30 years after the event, meaning that potentially, and this is maybe my assumption, but they had an opportunity to go through support services for a longer period of time, and therefore feel more equipped to take part in the research.
That's very interesting, Ken. I was wondering, were all your participants victims of male perpetrators?
Yes.
Yes, because having worked with men who've been sexually abused by women, I wonder if that's another barrier to speaking up. Anything that emphasises vulnerability and emasculation might make it harder to talk about.
Yeah, absolutely. The study was specifically focusing on male participants, but some participants came forward who had, so I couldn't include them because the study had a specific focus. A couple of men came forward who had experiences from a female perpetrator, which was very interesting. I think I did the interviews anyway because, and maybe this is something that we can come on a little bit later about how if a man comes forward and it might even not fit the recruitment criteria, there is almost an element of responsibility, knowing how hard it has been for them to come forward to listen to their story anyway.
Something about recognizing the validity of their position, I suppose.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah,
absolutely.
Yeah. So how many men did you interview in your sample?
I think nine male survivors were included in the final piece of the research. And the interviews were, some were very long. There was a particular one, a couple of them that I remember very, very clearly, that I spent the entire afternoon going from 1 o'clock till 4 or 5 in the afternoon between the introduction part, the interview when I pressed record, and the debrief. So it's almost as if the limited number of participants really helped me to spend time with them, to really get, and this is something that, as you mentioned maybe in the introduction, I really value and really work on, making sure that it's not just a mine of information. A participant shouldn't be treated as a database, and I have to get as much information as possible and then move to the next piece and so on and so forth. Really focus on the human experience, because the individual experience can really help to understand others and, you know, all things around generalizability and so on and so forth.
Thank you.
You chose to use interpretive phenomenological analysis, IPA, as your research methodology. Was there something particular about that approach? Not so much perhaps that you chose a qualitative approach, but why you chose that approach for your data analysis?
It links back to this idea of really wanting to focus on the individual experience, something that when thinking about back on the literature and how I got into this field, what was really, really missing was men's voices. There was a real gap in which a lot of authors were speaking about drawing implications from gendered research and masculinity and research around men's suicide and men's experience of interpersonal violence. But what was really missing is this big gap of men actually talking about their experiences. And using IPA helped me develop a framework, an approach, a way to think about experiences that really thinks of, we have major life events that can be anything, such as getting a promotion, having a child, or in this specific case, has these experiences of violence and abuse. And these experiences will shape our lives continuously for a prolonged period of time. And so taking those lenses, thinking these men have had really significant, really major experiences, how do they see this major experience shape their life? Really, really helped me try to put myself in a position where I could be insightful and feel that I could see through their eyes as much as possible, obviously. And IPA really does allow to, and I'm not going to bore you with the specifics, but what's really interesting as a methodology is that it goes through a lot of philosophical assumptions that are quite useful around how, as beings, we create experiences, how the importance of deconstructing meaning and things around ideography, so the individual experience, that really attracted me as a way to approach human experiences.
That makes a lot of sense. And what were the gendered narratives, or I suppose more colloquially, rape myths specific to men that emerged during the course of your research?
The ones, unsurprisingly, the two main ones were around the fact that real men cannot be raped. And that is, a man is too strong, is too both physically and mentally, a man is resilient. Therefore, a real man who is strong, resilient, it's impossible that they could be raped. And so many stereotypes were attached to it, such as that men are promiscuous and men go out of their way to engage in sexual relationships. And men are proactive, are sexually proactive. Therefore, the idea of them being victimized, subjected, overpowered defies, from a societal perspective, what we expect to happen to men. So this relates to masculinity. The sexuality myths instead really speak about how, as a society, we tend to have hostility towards same-sex relationships. And as the focus of my work focused on male experiences, a lot of the stereotypes were around, oh, well, it happens to gay men. Oh, well, and a lot of the participants were not gay in my sample, and in a lot of research, a lot of heterosexual and straight men have experience of sexual violence by the hands of other men. So that's a fact. And what was very interesting is that it was almost used to limit the event to a specific group. Oh, it's something abnormal that happens to a very type specific of men who are more prone to suffer those risks. I think what was really interesting in my research in itself was that those myths were presented by men, not only from how others saw them, but also how they saw themselves. Because a lot of the stereotypes or a lot of the ways that they used to describe themselves were related to masculinity. Or, well, I need to be a real man because a real man would have been raped or would have this experience of sexual violence. So I need to be strong. So there was a really interesting overlap between how society describes sexually violent incidents and how men see themselves, which really shows how it is important from an academic or policy perspective to think about society and attitudes, because a lot of those attitudes will fall back to those who are most affected by them, because they will use them to, and there is another strand of my research that focused on service providers and how service providers who specialized on working with male survivors often spent a substantial amount of their time working with them to deconstruct those assumptions that externally reinforced, if that makes sense. Externally and culturally reinforced.
Yeah, I was wondering as you were talking actually whether to what degree the men presenting you with their account were able to identify that those were myths, or how much there was a sense of having internalized those myths and holding on to them.
I think it varied, but I think to some extent, what was really interesting, and I'm sure you must have come across working with men with this, is that there is an it's almost as if there is an awareness of, as a man, I can cry, I can feel vulnerable, but I'm not going to anyway. So there is this awareness of all the stereotypes and myths and issues and expectations that are social, and there is an awareness that these expectations are social, but nonetheless, there is a need to hold on to those let's call them values or norms or expectations. So there's a very interesting duality between a lot of self-awareness and awareness of what's not necessarily what's right or what's wrong, but what's real and what isn't, and what is culturally reinforced and what isn't. But at the same time, and really, I think this speaks to how strong those scripts and norms are in our psyche, how hard it is to detach from those.
Yeah, thank you. And how did people cope with what had happened to them?
I think what was really interesting in that regard is that the stories were very different. The experiences were very, very unique. Perpetrators in their teens, in their adulthood, some involved weapons, some didn't, some there were substances involved, so on and so forth. Position of power, or a difference in power between the perpetrator and the survivor. And so it was very interesting to see how the coping mechanisms overlapped. And in some way, I think it's useful to think about what we lose when we have experiences, or what we feel we are losing when we have experiences of interpersonal violence. And what really comes across from men's voices is the idea of agency, safety, and control. And it was reflected in the coping mechanisms, as in men feel that they want to be agents in their lives, and therefore they will take really unhealthy levels of self-blame and responsibility. Well, I didn't act in a certain way, I didn't protect myself, and so on and so forth, therefore I'm the one to be blamed. And almost a way to take the power from the perpetrator or the abuser and the rapist to draw it back to themselves. And this was what was really interesting, that it comes across both from therapists working with male survivors and male survivors themselves, this real need to judge very harshly themselves. In terms of safety, I think that's probably the most evident one, because they feel extremely vulnerable. afterwards. And again, the difference is some were in their teens, so there is some element of developmental trauma in place, and the element of vulnerability, how it plays out in the lifespan. Others were in their adulthood, and so there is a social element to it. You know, adulthood is almost perceived with safety for men, and so that vulnerability and those experiences were very, very tough, and some went out of their ways. I think there are some extracts in one of my papers around how men really go out of their way to engage in fights, because it makes them feel, it's almost paradoxical, isn't it, that going out of the way to engage with aggressive acts to feel safe, because acting tough in the outside world will mean that the outside world will see you as tough. Therefore, I am tough, therefore I feel safe. This really complex, but almost very masculine needs. And around, so agency, safety, and feeling like they're in control, essentially. And what's interesting is seeing how survivors themselves feel about these experiences and how they recognize all of these issues, but at the same time keep linking back to those stereotypes, keep blaming themselves, or keep very subtly. There was a really interesting account from one participant who said, "Oh, I knew that I blamed myself excessively, that I wasn't responsible." And then just 10 minutes later, started, "Oh, well, I was young, I was naive, I probably should have didn't drink that much." So engaging in this almost double speak in which they at first say, "Yes, I'm aware I shouldn't blame myself, only the perpetrators should be blamed," but then going on to blame themselves anyway. So I think this is very interesting, and it really speaks about men in particular.
Yeah, I think there's something interesting, isn't there, about how we might know one thing but feel something different, and the importance, therefore, therapeutically, of not just engaging the cognitive part of the brain, because actually you can change the thoughts, but actually if you still feel in some kind of visceral way that you were responsible for what happened to you. But it's also interesting, I think, to hear about men engaging with, you know, kind of like a fight strategy, overcompensation to defend against vulnerability, because I think, given David's and I background in the criminal justice system, what we see is a lot of men who've spent big parts of their life, often from very, very early on, being victimised, sometimes in mainly a physical way, but actually heard many, many accounts of sexual abuse. And I wondered if there are other elements of coping that might lead to increased risk of contact with the criminal justice system beyond the fighting.
There is an element, and I think this links probably best with the strand of research that I'm doing with service providers, because I think that kind of work has a more of a holistic perspective of the lifespan of the survivor to some extent, because when working specifically with survivors, I was much more interested in their stories and the way that they express those stories. So in that regard, in terms of how does coping potentially increase contact with the criminal justice system, I think there is a very strong case for arguing that. And it's not only just the fighting, but there is an element to it that is very interesting, as how antisocial behavior at times, and I'm sure in your work as forensic psychologists or in the field of forensic psychology, you must have come across this. It almost overshadows the trauma that it's behind, in particular men's experiences. And there was this account from a service provider of a man receiving a service provider telling about one of his clients who was walking down the street and received a very homophobic and racist assault by a group of men, and it just reminded him of the vulnerability he felt in his when he was young as a victim, and then he attacked them. And so there's obviously layers to antisocial behavior that, unfortunately, given how the criminal justice system, and especially on the side of the police and prosecution, is formed, and it's not to blame the police or the prosecution per se, it's just how our system works. All of this is missed, especially on the perpetrator side, and this element of how a lot of, not all perpetrators, but a lot of perpetrators have experiences of trauma will be missed. Another part, I think, is substances. There were some participants who engaged quite a lot in using extreme substances as well, so from crack cocaine to cocaine, heroin, and so on and so forth. It might be obvious why, as a way of coping and as a way of, there was this idea of they felt like monsters, and using drugs helped them not feel that way. And again, it's unsurprising how then it increases contact with the criminal justice system, because they started dealing, for example. And so there are several opportunities, and maybe opportunity is the wrong word, for men to, and probably the fact of being men at the same time probably is an increased risk factor, if you want to speak, to increasing contact with the criminal justice system and engaging with those antisocial behaviors. So there is definitely scope for questioning how even the criminal justice system has an element for identifying trauma on first contact, even if it's coming from the perpetrator side.
Yes, I think it's interesting, because I think in the sort of field of criminal justice, we're much better at looking for these histories of trauma amongst women who've offended, but it's much, even I think even amongst, I don't know if you'd say the same, David, but even amongst practitioners treating men in the criminal justice system, people still seem to be guarded about understanding that as being a significant factor. So it can get spoken of as if it's part of the experience for some men, rather than a recognition that traumatic experiences are there in the histories of most people who are in prison, certainly. Is that your experience, David?
Yes, I think that's a very good point indeed. That certainly borne out in my experience at the work.
Ken, how did their experiences of sexual violence affect their identities as men, do you think?
I want to be very careful not claiming that there is an identity crisis, because, again, words can be loaded, and and we should try and avoid as much as possible labeling in a certain way. There was, however, a very clear before and after, before the abuse and after abuse, even for those participants who had experiences quite early on in the when they were 12, 13, 14, and so on and so forth. I think the best way that I can describe it in that regard is there's almost two sides. The side that wants to feel like men, and therefore I don't want to feel vulnerable. I want to feel strong. I want to feel accountable for my life. I want to feel resilient. But at the same time, there is maybe it's unfair, the survivor's side, which does feel vulnerable and does need support. And these two feelings and needs, one, maybe linking back to what you're saying earlier around the cognitive and the emotional side. The cognitive, the thoughts are telling me one thing, but my emotions are directing me towards the need of feeling like I need to be supported. And there is definitely an element of maybe crisis, yes, in terms of a schism, perhaps, between these two sides that are pulling in two different directions. And I think that's probably one of the, and this is maybe an hypothesis that I am making here, but this is probably one of the reasons why there is quite a significant delay for men reporting, disclosing, recognizing actually in the first place, and accessing support, because of these conflicting feelings of I want. What's very interesting, especially working with men, is that at the beginning there is an assumption of that admitting vulnerability would worsen their feelings, or an assumption that going out of the way to ask for support will make things worse. And therefore this sense and this emotion that accessing support will mean that they have given up, perhaps, or those very masculine thoughts. It's probably a really important barrier. That's why, linking back to the question you asked me earlier, David, around maybe viewing sexual violence as gendered, it links to that. The gendered experiences come across in these ways, in these subtle ways around why not asking for support, or why not disclosing, and how to deal with these contrasting emotions. It's very gendered in the individual experience, in my experience.
I was thinking that they may well have been right in fearing that if they disclosed to the police or whatever, that their following experience may well have been much worse. So arising from that, I was wondering how many of your participants did actually report to the police?
Surprisingly, I was surprised to find out that I appreciate it's a relatively small sample, but I was still surprised to see that 6 out of 9 of the participants who took part reported to the police. And again, it's probably the sample and the men who felt like they could come forward that almost created this skewness towards reporting to the police. And to what you were saying earlier, that maybe it's a fair assumption that men have that their accessing support will worsen their emotions. It was most definitely the case in the group of men that I worked with for my research around the fact that they reported to the police, and it was really, really sad, actually, just to removing the academic language. It was really, really sad to see how they started or saw in reporting an opportunity to seek that institutional validation that is so important, finding that a legal or an institution recognizes that what happened to you was a crime is very powerful, because especially for groups of men who felt like they've been silenced, they felt like they're invisible, they feel like they're voiceless, to have the criminal justice system, such an umbrella organization that represents the police, the prosecution, the court, and our country in many ways. They feel like it could be very powerful. However, again, the system is far more complex than that, and there are several layers to be considered. Police officers need to find evidence, and in finding evidence, they have to pose questions in maybe sometimes unnecessarily harsh ways, because they are there to collect information. And a lot of the time, there was this particular survivor who said he felt like he was bludgeoned by police officers, by their words and by their questioning. And what was key is that almost bar one, all of the survivors withdraw their allegations because they felt like they couldn't see themselves going on for years. Because that's unfortunately the state of the criminal justice system in the UK. Reporting to the police, it's just the beginning of a very, very long journey. And men felt like they needed to withdraw because the psychological burden of being interrogated, feeling like you're guilty until proven innocent, was very, very powerful and very sad.
Well, given your description there, Ken, do you think you did learn anything useful about how the police could handle such things better?
Again, I think there is a very let's call it tendency to pile in on the criminal justice system to an extent, which is a very complex system, and they're a very underfunded system as well. So I want to be careful making recommendations to the police. But at the same time, what was clear is that what men were looking for, so really specifically focusing on male survivors, and this might not be very academic or very scientific perhaps, but they were just really looking for a sympathetic ear, or a police officer who felt like they cared about their experiences. I think this really speaks about how services can play a part, and when I speak about services, I speak about services in general, both in terms of therapeutic support and the criminal justice system, is that showing sympathy and empathy to men's experiences, and that doesn't have to be sexual violence. It can be anything in terms that upsets them, which can be both interpersonal or in their domestic lives and so on and so forth. Well, that can be powerful in itself because it's giving recognition, and a lot of the time, what men were looking for was recognition and action. So maybe this doesn't specifically answer your question, David, but it's around that a more humane approach to men could certainly go a long way to make them feel like they can continue being part of the criminal justice process. and hopefully, and police officers by themselves, for example, cannot solve the issues of prosecution threshold, for example. That's a very difficult area and difficult balance that they have to play with both the victim's needs, the CPS needs, and so on and so forth. However, police officers represent a gateway for further support in directing men to asking or accessing therapeutic support, but also that institutional recognition that men seem to be looking for when they engage with the criminal justice system. So a more sympathetic and humane response could go a long way to keep them engaged, perhaps.
Thank you.
It's really interesting, isn't it? Because we know that kind of like a key factor whether experiencing a traumatic incident becomes a trauma as such is the response that people get from. And so actually, I guess if you met with somebody who's sympathetic and appears to believe what you're saying, would therapeutically be of some value, even if the court doesn't find the perpetrator guilty at the end of the day.
And I think that links again to the type, to the man itself, because a lot of the time they would go on, very rarely they go on to report immediately after the event. And actually a lot of the time men went to report maybe 5, 10, 15, 20 years. So there is an element that they feel like they overcome part of the initial traumatic experience of the non-recognition from the family and the support. So going back to the police, there is an element of re-victimization if the response is not humane and not sympathetic and is hostile and doesn't recognize their experiences. So actually, it can have very detrimental mental health consequences for men if the response is not appropriate. And this is something that's very important also from the services point of view, because specialized services on men are very limited in this country. And a lot of the men I spoke to, their experiences, they accessed female-orientated services, and they felt like the response wasn't as humane. And I'm quoting survivors here by saying that they felt that if they were women, they would be treated differently. And that's very powerful in a negative sense. So again, humane responses and the ability, and this is where training comes forward, to direct towards the right resources. And I can imagine in your field, specialism is so important, especially when working with men, because the men and women are not the same, and therapeutic approaches need to be different when dealing with, especially with traumatic experiences.
Thank you. And Ken, you finished your PhD. Where do you plan to take your research interest in the future?
I think I still want to work with men. I'm not done with them, let's put it this way. And what I'm really interested in, and I'm actively working towards, is focusing on ethnic minorities. As I said at the beginning of the interview, I'm originally from Sri Lanka. My parents are from Sri Lanka, so I'm very, very interested in seeing how those cultural influences may affect recognition and disclosure, because the evidence from, again, it's very interesting. A lot of the work we do with men in the sexual violence field starts from women's experiences, and the evidence from women from ethnic minorities suggests that our understanding is very limited because families and cultural systems do not allow disclosure or public disclosure. Therefore, there is certainly a substantial group of men from ethnic minorities that are quite literally invisible. And therefore, using the approach of IPA and focusing on individual experiences, I think there is a real opportunity to, maybe this sounds a bit romantic, but shine a light into their experiences. So I hope to go there.
Thank you. And how did completing this research help you grow and develop as a person?
It's difficult to say, because maybe you'll have to ask my wife potentially. But I do feel that I am more attuned with my masculinity, perhaps, and because again, again, this is something that happens in IPA. There is this back and forth, or there is an expectation that you should do a back and forth between yourself and the participant, the transcript that you're analyzing. And so a lot, as you can imagine, a lot of the interviews were around me trying to identify ways in which masculinity came forward in explaining men's experiences. And so I had to, by asking those questions to the transcript and to the survivors, or actually asking those questions to myself as well. And this is something that I think it's so powerful in this type of research, because it's a very human experience in which you learn from others, and in asking questions in a certain way. It was very interesting. In some interviews, I asked a question in a certain way, and men telling me, well, no one has ever asked me that question. For example, asking them, do you think if you were a woman, people would have treated you that way? And men finding that wasn't the case. Oh, sorry, computer. And yeah, so I feel like I had the opportunity to reflect and I think potentially work on myself.
Thank you. Finally, Ken, you've obviously had to hear some pretty painful accounts. How did you cope with that? What advice would you give to others about how to cope?
It's very difficult, because my advice is that prepare to be unprepared, potentially, because that's very late. There are some stories that are very, very difficult to prepare for. And I think it is maybe links back to what my recommendation to the criminal justice system and to services, trying to approach men's stories and survivor stories in general as humanely as possible can be a very powerful tool, not only to help them and safeguard, but also to safeguard yourself, because you put yourself in a position where I'm just interested. It's a framework. It's a potentially a state of mind, a perspective that you're trying to take, which is I'm only interested in their story, and I want to learn from them and giving them a space to tell their story. And it's a very interesting phenomenon, perhaps. You're protecting yourself and you're putting in the best position to listen to these stories. And if I can give a second advice, perhaps, is that if anyone is interested in doing research with men, to do it, because it's extremely rewarding. There are many challenges to overcome. But when you give a platform to groups who are silenced, voiceless, or invisible, the stories are mostly tragic, very sad, but at the same time incredibly rewarding, because you've seen the therapeutic effect that it has on people, and helping others has a therapeutic effect to yourself, I think, as well. So it's a double win.
It sounded like you were saying something about having integrity, really, in your position with the first part of your answer, which holding on to your own integrity and appreciating that therefore has integrity in terms of impact on your participants. So very interesting. Thank you.
I hope so. Or at least I like to think that I'm trying to be authentic, perhaps. This is not very scientific. I don't think you're going to see this in many handbooks for quality. Maybe, perhaps, but be yourself and be prepared to be a nice person helps.
But Ken, how did you keep yourself cheerful after hearing these painful stories, which had been held on to for decades in some cases?
Yes. Maybe cheerful, not so much. But I think that what's really, really interesting here is that just to give you percentages, for example, out of an interview, 90% of it was around the suffering and the trauma and the pain that the men experienced. But the 10% in which they wanted to show me how they overcome this pain, or how they were aware they were in the journey towards overcoming and breaking their silence, was really, really touching and really inspiring in many ways. I think that the survivors, the 10 and 11 survivors who took part in my research really inspired me about what and I don't mean this in a very in a gendered or sexist way, about what it means to be a man, or how being a man in accepting the suffering and accepting or acknowledging the suffering and the pain can be used to become a potentially a better person, or to move forward. And so,
which is very powerful, considering it sounds like feeling a bit emasculated at times was a theme that was there for your participants. So the fact that it had that powerful sense of masculinity throughout was really fascinating.
Now, and what's really interesting is that a lot of them acknowledge that they were just at the beginning of a journey to recovery. A lot of them told me very specifically about their nightmares and the flashbacks and very PTSD-like symptoms. And from a clinical perspective, we know how it's very difficult to handle all of these emotions. And yet were wanted to show, but I'm still here, I'm still fighting, and I'm still surviving, and that's fine.
Thank you very much, Ken.
Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
That was terrific.
Thank you.